Take it away.
All right. Welcome to everyone. I guess I'm going to run this thing today. We're going to have a workshop today talking about camera selection for astronomy. I'm going to start out, and then we've got a number of experts here with us to talk about different types of cameras that they use. I'd like to welcome all the new members to the club and anyone looking for a camera for the first time. We're going to try to target that. We may dig into some more advanced topics. I'd like to try to keep most of that to the questions. So as we're going through things, if you have a short comment, please, how do you want to handle that, Chris? If they have a question or a comment.
Well, if we can do it, I guess sort of like the imaging meeting, I'll pull up my chat window. So everybody should have a Zoom group chat window. So if you have a question, I'll just continuously monitor it as the presentation goes on. How about that?
Yeah, that'd be good. And as I said, if you have like a short comment or question that we can answer and keep moving, we'll do that. But anything a little more complicated, like going to take more than a paragraph to answer, I think let's do that in the questions because we have a lot to get through, and I think that'll keep things moving. So am I screen sharing? I am. Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and start this up. And yeah, I just have a bunch of cameras. Most of these are newer cameras. There's some older CCDs on the left just for entertainment, I guess, because I don't know many people are buying those anymore. We're all buying these red and blue cameras, or Nikons and Canons. So basically going to start talking about just how we're all into imaging. It's really a good time to start imaging. It's very accessible. If you were at my talk last week, it's really changed in the last 15 years. And it's still not, I wouldn't call it cheap, but it is much more inexpensive than ever, not just for cameras, but telescopes and mounts. Now, everything we're going to talk about today is using a digital sensor. We're not going to talk about using film. It is still possible to use film, but I don't know many people doing that. It's so much easier and convenient to use digital sensors. So I'm going to go through just a quick overview of using digital sensors in case someone's not familiar with that, and then talk about different types of cameras, their use cases, and just do some comparisons between different types, how their strengths and weaknesses kind of compare. Then we'll have some club members talk about their cameras, and then we'll get to the questions. So all the sensors we're going to talk about today are using semiconductor sensors, and they're much more sensitive than film. That's one of the reasons we use them. Also, obviously, you can read them out and reuse them. You don't have to keep buying more film for every time you want to shoot. These sensors generally are going to need a computer to take data or take images. So if you want to use it with your telescope, you're going to have to hook a computer up to those astro cameras to use them. A DSLR, you don't need a computer to use. It can be mighty handy though, but you could use a DSLR just standalone. The general idea is we're going to take a lot of images, sometimes many hours of images, and then do processing later to create a final image that's much better than any of those individual images. And that's what we'll refer to as long exposure imaging. There's also a technique where you take lots of images in a shorter period and you view it as if you were using the telescope visually. And that's EAA, or real-time viewing. And that's another technique we're going to talk about. But most of what we'll talk about today is more long exposure, the more traditional kind of imaging. As I said, you need a computer to take the data generally. Even with a DSLR, you pretty much need a computer to process the data that you're going to take. There are some exceptions to that with DSLRs, but generally you're going to have to load the data on a computer and do some work on it with a variety of software dedicated to astronomy image processing. So if you know a lot about computers, that's very helpful. If you don't know much about computers or you don't like computers, there's still things you can do, but that's something you're going to probably want to investigate before you invest any money, because it's like everything else, it's very much tied to computers these days.
Mike, I want to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
I don't know if you're on a different screen right now, but I'm still seeing, at least on my computer, the interest stream with the various types on there. Are you?
Okay. Uh, I'm on a different screen, so I appreciate. Yeah, I don't understand this particular software, so let me just do it this way, if that's all right. You
Yeah,
can
it's pretty much
see
everything.
the types of cameras and terminology.
Yes, I can.
Okay, we'll just stick with this. I think it's large enough. We're all looking at it on our screen. Um, so we might be throwing around some terminology here, so I thought I'd just cover some of it in case someone's not familiar with it. I assume everyone knows what a DSLR are. We're talking about the common cameras, not as common as they used to be, but it's a pretty high quality camera. It has a removable lens. You will take that lens off generally to put it on a telescope. OSC, if you see that, it stands for one-shot camera, one-shot color camera. Those take a color image in one shot. DSLR is an example of a OSC. There's dedicated astronomy cameras that also are. Mono is for a monochrome camera. Those take an image that's gray, and you need to use filters and several images to construct a color image. So there's a little more work involved with those. Uncooled camera is where you don't have any cooler on the camera, like a DSLR, and the sensor operates at whatever the temperature is outside, and sometimes a little hotter. A cooled camera has some form of electrical or other cooling to control the temperature of the sensor, and this is important because the cooler you can get the sensor, the less noise the sensor will have, which is really helpful when you're trying to detect faint objects like we are. EAA is electrically assisted astronomy. Some people call that real-time viewing. Here you're using a camera and a telescope for observation. So instead of rolling out a 20-inch Dobsonian, you get a much smaller telescope and a camera and take a series of images, and you'll end up revealing more detail than you would have seen through a larger telescope to begin with. So that's becoming extremely popular. And finally, long exposure imaging is where you probably what most people are more familiar with when you think of astrophotography. You take lots of long exposures, and then later you combine those to make a final image, and then you'll do additional processing later on a computer. So I'm going to shoot through these pretty quick. Stop me if there's a question. But DSLRs, Jay's going to talk about them more, but they're pretty inexpensive compared to traditional CCD cameras. Not as inexpensive compared to the CMOS cameras we have today, though. You can get them used, and then they're pretty cheap. You do have to worry about shutter counts and things like that, but you can find some good deals. You don't need a computer. You could hook it up to a telescope and use like a remote shutter control and just take pictures that way. But generally people find a computer is pretty handy to have for a variety of reasons, even with a DSLR. You don't need any additional filters. You get color images straight out of it. Obviously, it's easy to use with a camera lens. A lot of people start out with just a camera lens and a DSLR and take images that way. Nightscapes, star trails, just a ton of things they're really good for. And of course, you can double their use for daytime photography. But they're not cooled, so this time of year, summer, spring, some of the fall, they tend to be fairly noisy because the sensor warms up and it just creates more noise with temperature. And that makes it kind of tricky to take what are called darks. There's a frame type you need to take that matches the temperature of your light frames. You can do it, but it's a little trickier since you can't control the temperature. And unless they're modified, which increases the cost considerably, they just don't work well for capturing nebula. They have a filter in them which you have to have removed, and they work fine for comets and galaxies and star clusters, all these things, but nebula they just don't work well with at all. Now uncooled astrocams can be color or mono, and we see those used mainly for guiding or planetary, lunar, and solar, where you're taking very short exposures and generally very bright targets, so you don't worry about the cooling as much. Also, EAA is a good use case. You're taking shorter exposures there. People have adopted OSC cameras for that. You need a computer to capture. There's no buttons. There's nothing on it. It's literally a camera you plug into a USB port. These tend to be smaller than those we use for long exposure, and they tend to be pretty inexpensive, and they're a really good deal for these use cases. Cooled astrocams are also color or mono. These we use for long exposure, where you're taking minutes at a time per exposure. Now, they can usually be used as, you can use them for planetary and other uses, as well as a guide camera if you really felt like it, and EAA. They are fairly expensive, so generally people don't buy them for that purpose. But if you owned one, you could probably get dual use out of it. Since you can control the temperature, you can keep the sensor cool in the summer, and it's pretty, you can identically match the dark temperatures. So this may not mean much to you now if you're a beginner, but as you get more advanced and you start getting into this, these are nice quality of life things to have. And you, like the uncooled astrocams, you have to have a computer for getting images and for processing it later. So one of the first questions you're going to hit when you start looking at cameras is, do you want a one-shot color or a monochrome camera? You have to make that choice right up front. You either pick one or the other. So one thing about a one-shot color camera is if you're out shooting data at Big Woods and you wanted to shoot for 4 hours and you got 2 hours and it clouded up and you had to leave, each frame has all the color data. So you could stack your 2 hours and get an image. Whereas with a monochrome camera, you would have to shoot a red, a green, and a blue image separately at a minimum. And you may only get 1 or 2 of those filters before you have to leave. So you're going to have to just wait till your next trip out to a dark site to get the rest of that data. That's just the nature of using monochrome and filters. So that can be a consideration if you don't get out a lot. That might be to your advantage to have a one-shot color. If you live somewhere like I do and it's light polluted and you don't get out very often, but you have a yard where you can see enough of the sky to image, a mono camera is extremely good for narrowband imaging. It's a type of imaging with special filters that gives you pseudo-color images of nebula. And I'm sure you've probably seen these, but when you use those filters, you're essentially at a dark site for those emission bands. So if you're shooting from light pollution a lot, mono is worth giving a real consideration. You can use a one-shot color camera for narrowband. It's compromised by a number of factors. I tried it for a while. I didn't find it pleasing, so I invested in a monochrome camera, but that is an option. Now where OSCs are really great are something like a RASA, which is a type of telescope where the camera actually sits in front of the telescope. You can't put a filter wheel there. You'd block the opening to the telescope. So a nice compact one-shot color camera works great there. You can adapt both of these to work with camera lenses, but generally an OSC is going to be good if you shoot from a dark site a lot, whereas a mono is going to be your friend if you're in light pollution. And as I said earlier, but a DSLR and a one-shot color camera have very similar use cases. So there's some similarities there. The other one is DSLR or an astrocam. Now, if you own a DSLR, it's certainly worth giving it a shot and trying it. In addition, you don't need a computer. So if you are, like Chris said earlier, you're going to travel somewhere dark and you take a small tracking mount, you can fit it all in a backpack and take it out camping. DSLRs are really good for that. An astrocam, you're going to have some kind of computer and more power supplies. You know, astrocams don't have batteries in them, so it just gets complicated. DSLRs are a little bit easier, are easier to use with a camera lens. You need adapters that cost more money and take some care to put together to use a camera lens with an astrocam. The astrocams are cooled, so they're lower noise, and an unmodified DSLR is just not good for nebula at all. So that's kind of rules them out. You can modify the DSLR, but it adds expense, and as far as I know, it's going to pretty much void the warranty. So if that's important to you, that's something to think about. I got a lot of typos in this one. DSLRs are best at dark sites and in cooler times of the year, whereas the mono will work at dark sites. But in addition, it's great for if you're in light pollution to shoot narrowband.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
So I got a question from Mike Keefe. He was asking whether if with newer CMOS cameras and software, can you use a one-shot color in mono and get similar results?
You mean combine the mono data with the RGB data?
No, I think he's just referring to that. Can you use one-shot color in mono mode? I missed that word, but mono.
No.
Whoops. Did we lose him?
Yeah. Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, no, the question was, and I've never done it. Just I know that with my one-shot color, I can tell it to go into mono mode. And I just don't know if that, and then if you wanted to put filter wheels on top of that, I know that, you know, in other words, can you get similar results from a one-shot color in mono mode with filter wheels as you could with a traditional mono camera? I don't know if there's a sensitivity issue.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with that mode since most one-shot color cameras have microscopic color filters over each pixel. You can't disable them, but many of them are sensitive in the near infrared. And so some cameras will put a near infrared pass visible light block. That's what security cameras do. And so you get a monochrome image in infrared. So it's not passing any optical light. So that's what I'm familiar with. So people do use that for planetary. They'll shoot illuminates and infrared. In theory, longer wavelengths are less affected by turbulence. So they shoot color, then they switch it over and shoot near infrared for illuminates, and then combine those. But that's all I'm familiar with.
The issue with using a one-shot color in mono mode is what it's doing is it's just combining the colors, but it still has the Bayer matrix over it. And so you're still filtering out selectively. So if you put a red filter over that, you're only using one of the 4 pixels available. And so that's where the sensitivity issue comes in. You can do it, I do it, but it's very inefficient.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So there's trade-offs, but as we said, the one-shot color does have some simplifies your setup and can be easier to use. Let's see. So we were starting this frame. So as I said before, EAA is more of a visual observing, and it's not necessarily trying to take images that you're going to print out later. Now, you can certainly do that, but the real advantage is taking a lot of frames, short frames, and then you stack them in real time so that the image is continuously updating on your screen. Now, some advantages are, since you're taking short exposures, you don't need extremely good tracking, which can be tricky to get, especially with some of the less expensive mounts. And if you use an OSC, that you're going to immediately get a color image out of this. Nowadays, people generally use a computer for collecting and viewing the data. There are some options where you don't need a computer, but I think they're slowly getting phased out in favor of the more sensitive cameras used on a computer. Now, you can go much deeper in long exposure imaging where you take lots of images, like I'm talking hours of images, and you do a lot of post-processing that you can pull out a lot of details that you don't get with EAA. But nowadays, since you're using a computer with software like SharpCap, you can watch the image as it's being collected show up on the screen and save the data. So later you could go process it like a long exposure image. So it's not really a versus here. It's just it's a kind of a spectrum. EAA is a lot of short exposures, and long exposure is just more longer exposures. But it is extremely popular now, and it's really gathering steam. So I recommend a lot of people when they start out try this first, because you can usually do it with your existing equipment. So I don't want to get into this too much, but something to consider that you need to think about is for a particular camera and a particular telescope, and this came up on the imaging forum this week, you need to think about the field of view and the pixel scale that you'll be operating at. So if you're used to using a telescope visually, if you put different eyepieces in a given telescope, your magnification changes and you see more or less of the sky and more or less of the details. Well, we don't use an eyepiece with imaging, but some of those ideas still carry over. The larger the sensor is in your camera, then the more of the sky you'll take a picture of it at a given image. So a DSLR will see more of the sky than a small guide camera. Likewise, if the pixels in your sensor are bigger or smaller, then each individual pixel of your image is going to show a bigger or larger part of whatever you're taking an image of. So you need to try to match those. And that's something, if you ask us about on the imaging list, we'll certainly help you with. But generally a large scope, like an 8-inch SCT or RC, you're going to need a larger sensor to get a given object to fit in the image than if you were to use a small refractor. And there's some limits. Now these larger telescopes will have smaller pixel scales, meaning potentially they could detect smaller parts of the object, but because our atmosphere generally doesn't cooperate, there's a limit to how small a pixel you really need. And if you have too little focal length, so you use like a 50 millimeter camera lens, you're not going to capture all the details that are there because each pixel is just too large. It's looking at too much of the object at once. So these are things you have to kind of weigh against each other and consider when you're buying setting up a camera and a telescope. So these some final considerations, and then we'll move on to the club members talking. Again, the camera and focal length are two things you need to consider. If you are in a light polluted location, narrowband is really magic. It's just amazing what you can do with it. Whereas if you have a DSLR or one-shot color camera, and a dark site, they are quite capable there. If you get too large a sensor, say bigger than a DSLR, APS-C size, you're probably going to have to invest a lot of money into a telescope that's actually going to deliver a nice looking image over that entire sensor. And potentially you're going to need some very expensive large filters. So when you start getting much bigger than a DSLR, you are going to get into some very expensive setups. So they look sexy and interesting, but you have to be aware they are extremely expensive. And also, probably the most important thing that you are going to buy is a mount. And the telescope is also important. So when you're looking at camera options, don't put all your money into the camera, because having a great camera and a bad mount is a trail of tears. That is no fun at all. So you have to budget accordingly.
And probably the most common real beginner mistake.
Right. And finally, just something we kind of don't always talk about, but what are your expectations? Because some people will be satisfied with a given setup and some people will not be happy with it. And, we can't really tell you what your satisfaction level is going to be. That's something everyone kind of has to figure out for themselves. But if you go online to AstroBin and other places, just look at a lot of the images and kind of start picking out the images you like and look at the type of equipment they used and how much data they acquired, and talk to us about what you've seen and what you want to do, and then be prepared to maybe reset those initial expectations. It's an extremely challenging hobby. It's a lot of fun and rewarding when you get it figured out, but there is a learning curve, and it's worth being aware of that before you start investing money. And one way to do that is to get data from other people who have taken data with their telescopes, and they can help you try to process that yourself. And you can figure out if you want to do this, because processing can be tricky. If you don't like computers, it may be something you don't want to do. So this is a good way to get some experience before you spend any money on equipment. Certainly try to use your current equipment, even if it's not optimal. And just understand when people advise you about what they think a good setup is, and it may not include the equipment you have, that's because they're trying to make this as smooth for you to get up that learning curve. And there are certainly some setups that are extremely hard, even for an experienced person, to get satisfactory images from. So if you choose to start with that, you may succeed, but it's, you've ramped the challenge scale way up. So just understand, we're just trying to help you get where you want to get the easier way. So
Hey, Michael, can I make
Yeah.
a comment about that particular point?
yeah, thanks, David.
I don't know if we've got a lot of folks that are new to astrophotography on this meeting. I saw a few names that I didn't recognize, but that because I'm old and I can't remember anything, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are newbies. But here's the comment based on what Michael just said. The only really active forum for astrophotography and telescope stuff in general on the web is Cloudy Nights. And if you are new to this and you get onto Cloudy Nights and you start asking questions about what equipment to purchase, what you're on is universally going to be told, now this is for AP, not visual use. You'll universally be told to get a short refractor, and then you may get various advice about whether to start with a DSLR or to start with a dedicated astronomy camera. And then a rather large, heavy mount. At least a lot of people look at them as large, heavy mounts. What Michael said about using the equipment that you got is important. It is true that, and I've talked privately to a number of the kind of old hands on Cloudy Nights about this. But one thing to realize if you're a newbie is that a lot of the folks on the astrophotography forum that often answer beginners have a particular motivation to try to get somebody else into the hobby, for lack of a better word. And it is very true what Michael said is that, long focal length setups that you might see somebody buy for visual use, like an SCT on a fork mount, is going to be tough to do with astrophotography. The only reason I mention this is quite a number of people have basically been told to throw away the equipment that they've just thrown thousands of dollars at because it's the wrong thing to use for astrophotography. My personal opinion is that people can make their own decisions. And while there is zero doubt, those of us that have done this for a while, that an 80 millimeter refractor or something with equivalently short focal length and a dedicated astrophotography camera makes doing astrophotography easy. In my opinion, it does a disservice to the newbies on Cloudy Nights when one of the old hats basically tells them, well, you bought all the wrong thing, even though you spent, a few $1,000s on it. So throw that away and go buy another few $1,000s worth of stuff. And like I said, this is just my opinion, but as Michael said, a lot of times it's best to use what you've got, even if it might not be optimal for the particular purpose. And that will tell you yourself, well, okay, if I spend some more money on a better mount or a shorter focal length telescope or a better camera, then you'll know what you can expect as far as improving your experience with a hobby.
Thanks, David. Yeah, certainly. Just the important thing is just speak up in the forums. I just encourage people to. Everyone here wants to help, and there is no beginner level that is not part of what we want to help with. We've helped people over the last 5 years on all kinds of levels. So just give it a try. So now I'm going to switch over to Jay. He's going to talk about DSLRs, mostly Nikon, but just in general, how to use DSLRs for imaging. You ready, Jay?
Yes, I'm trying to share my screen.
Okay, I have to let go, so I'm going to get out of here. There we go.
All right, can you see that?
Yeah, thank you.
That's good.
Okay, did it change?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. A lot of this, I think Michael's already talked about. One of the key features of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, which I'll include because they are relatively new development and actually physically better suited for astrophotography than DSLRs, just because they don't have the moving parts in there. But one of the key features of DSLRs is that they're self-contained. You don't need a computer to run it. You can preview and program all of your images by themselves. In fact, the other day, when I was first taking some pictures of neowise, I just brought out my 2 cameras and an infrared remote on the tripod and was shooting them that way. The sensor sizes that are available typically are 2 sizes now. There were a lot of variety initially. The crop format, also known as APS-C, which actually is a little bit different depending on the brand, is what came out first in an affordable format. And so almost everybody and all the astronomical equipment is based around that field of view. There's also full frame, which a lot of diehards from the film world have stuck to, is a larger format that's the same size as the 35mm film frame. And those are the cameras that I have, just because all of my other equipment was tailored around that. And the criticisms of using a full frame are certainly true. Everything is more expensive, but it's kind of the smaller sensor, and you buy a telescope and adapters and filters and everything to accommodate that, and you're going to want to stick to it. If you start with full frame and you've already bought this, and then you buy more cameras and you buy more equipment, then you may want to stick to that. It's kind of an addiction. Once you start down one path, it's hard to switch over. They're designed for conventional photography. This is one of the drawbacks of DSLRs, is they weren't made for astro, but in the past 15 years or so, more and more, or at least the 2 main camera makers have adapted their firmware and a lot of other things so that you can use them for astro. But in any case, there are a lot of DSLRs out there that were just automate everything, and that's not going to work very well for astro. You need to be able to manually control it. You need to know what the camera is doing at any given time. You don't want it to do auto focus or auto exposure or auto white balance. And some of the noise reduction modes are very counterintuitive to further processing. Early DSLRs were quite a bit of compromise in terms of quality that you could get out of the images. They were noisy, not very sensitive, but they've come a long way. In the past 5 to 10 years, I'd say the chip makers have made the CMOS chips so incredibly good that you have a very low noise level, not to the point like a cool camera, but much lower. For example, my Nikons for amp glow, when I blow up a dark frame, all I see is a little bit of a gradient down at the bottom. It's not this huge, horrendous amp glow that you see in some nightmare scenarios published. But also, one of the best things that DSLRs are good for, and has become more and more popular, is nightscape photography. And there's a lot of the DSLR development that has made them more astro capable has come out of the popularity of nightscape photography, which is kind of a separate discipline from what we do, but it's very much the same at the same time. The history was of DSLRs for astro use is Canon was the first company to really recognize that this is a way to expand their market, and so they started supporting it. And the earlier Canon cameras that they did that with were APS-C format. About 15 years ago, I probably should correct that, Nikon decided, hey, wait a minute, we can do this too. And so there have been a lot of dedicated Nikon followers like myself, because I had many years in equipment and things like that, and I didn't really want to switch out my whole system. And so I waited for Nikon to come out with a good full frame camera that was appropriate, the D600, back around 2013, I believe. And so, and since then, because of the Nikon enthusiasts, they quickly developed as many tools that are good for Nikons as there are for Canon. So I'd say they're about equally useful for astrophotography at this point. Sony is much later joining the fray, because but they have some very highly regarded mirrorless cameras that you see a lot on the forums for nightscape photography. This was natural for Sony to get into this arena, because they make the CMOS sensors that at least Nikon uses, and probably Canon too in many cases. Some of the reasons that you want to use a DSLR is, well, the best one is you already have one. If you already have one, then use it, give it a try. And in my case, I had a lot of other lenses, adapters, things like that. And so all along, I just, rather than converting everything over to Canon, which at the time had a real lead, I just waited for Nikon to come along. Also, the camera lenses that you use for daytime photography are also usually very good for wide field astrophotography. The downside is that's not universally true. There are a lot of lenses out there that in a daytime photo, if you shoot them wide open, don't look that soft, but you see horrendous stars if you shoot them at the widest aperture. So buyer beware in that case. Try the ones that you have, but do a lot of research on anything that you're considering buying. DSLRs are excellent for certain uses. For full images of the sun and the moon, you probably want to use a different type of camera if you're trying to get the greatest resolution out of it. For nightscapes, star trails, animations, and unguided wide field. And you can even do deep sky with a little bit of extra effort, but it's not as easy as it is with a cool camera. Of course, we talked a bit about imaging without a computer. The thing you have to look for if you're buying a DSLR for Astra, look for one that supports exposure times of at least 30 seconds natively, because bulb exposures without a computer or a dedicated intervalometer may not be possible with a lot of models. It's not with mine. I would need something else to be able to do longer than 30 seconds. You also need, or at least very helpful to have tilting view screens, time-lapse capability, high-resolution video capture, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and mirror lockup if you have a mirrored camera. Wi-Fi capability can also let you go in between. You can control your camera with a phone or a tablet instead of carrying out a lot of computer equipment.
Hey, Jay.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. You've got about a few more minutes for this section. Okay.
Okay.
So just give me a heads up. Thanks.
All right. I'll try to blast through it. The lower cost is another good reason. It's especially for the large sensors. That gap is narrowing. ASI has really thrown a lot of things different from what they used to be. And if you also, like I did, want a camera that doubles for non-astro work, it's possible, but there's a compromise to be had. Unmodified DSLRs are block about 75% of H alpha and sulfur 2 light. And modified DSLRs costs more, as was mentioned, but you can never really achieve a perfect daylight balance without additional filters. Canon offers some filters that allow you to do that actually fit into the camera body. The drawbacks of DSLR is no cooling. We talked about that a bit. It's generally only available in one-shot color, and so that's good for rapidly changing targets, comets, planets, nightscapes, but it's very efficient for narrowband. Spectral response and the cuts in the deep red because of the properties of the filters that are used in the Bayer matrix. They have to cut off the deep red, or else they can't ever achieve a really good balance. And so to make up for that, you can still shoot nebular, even though it's you may feel like you're pulling your hair out because it's much attenuated. You have less sensor control than you do with a dedicated Astrocam, which initially may not, if you're a beginner starting out, you may not even understand what that means, but what it does is it means that you're, again, giving control of certain important aspects of your imaging over to whatever the firmware engineer did for that model of camera.
Can I interject when you're done, Jay?
Yes.
Only when you're done. When you're done.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll certainly take questions. Another thing I found with DSLRs is using them to capture video can be problematic because, for my example, the native chip is about 6,000 by 4,000 pixels. When it takes video, it reduces that to HD, which is 1920 by 1080. And so it's interpolating the full frame into a much smaller video format. I think some DSLRs, maybe Canons, can do this, where they'll take a native pixel resolution as video, but the Nikons I have certainly can't do that. And so what that does is it wastes your magnification if you're trying to take images of planets. And so you have to use longer exposure times or some other sort of change in your optical training to make up for it. There are custom modded and astro-specific DSLRs available, and these were around Life Pixel converted one of my cameras to H-alpha sensitivity. And there's some interesting ones that I wouldn't really recommend using that actually converted DSLRs to cooled cameras. And there's a list of some of those there. My recommendations, I'm not going to recommend specific models. There's so much out there, but I can tell you that read a lot. Cloudy Nights was mentioned. Ask people in this club. But mainly, if you see opinions or comments based on anything older than about 5 or 10 years, they may be out of date and may not be true anymore. I know there was a big war between Canon and Nikon on the forums for a long time, and it's mainly gone away now. I think most of the experience in the club is with Canons, and I know there's some other people in the club who use Nikons, but I'm the one I can name off the top of my head. The A7 series of Sony's also seem to be very low noise and long exposure images, but they have few Astro tools available to support them. The other thing is, if you want to use DSLR for deep sky types of things, use lots of frames. The non-repeating pattern noise in uncooled CMOS is very difficult to calibrate out. I can look at 2 different dark frames and they look entirely different in terms of particular pixels that are lighter than others. And so I would recommend at least 30 or more light, dark, and bias frames. Of course, the the bias and the flat frames are very easy and quick to do anyway. As Michael mentioned, shoot when it's cold. It's clearest around here when it's really cold anyway, so that's a benefit that helps. Capture raw, always capture raw, or else you're not going to be able to be very successful in processing them afterwards. The JPEG format that is default for most DLSRs adulterates the data and makes subsequent processing a real problem. You get all kinds of artifacts. But if you're doing star trails, videos, nightscapes, may not be an issue. The ISO setting, there's a lot of debate on this and a lot of opinions. And I can certainly weigh in on that, but I'll save that for another time. Imaging with DLSRs using computer control, rather than list all the possibilities here, I've just put a couple of large resources of all kinds of tools that have been listed. There's not a lot of, or some of these aren't as recent as and up to date as they should be. One of my favorites for Nikon, and they say, and I've never tested it, that they support quite a few Canons and Sonys as well, is Digicam control. It's just a capture routine, except that it also hooks into PhD for guiding. It'll dither between exposures and a number of other different things.
Hey, Jay.
Yes.
We're going to have to kind of keep moving. We got a few people. Do you want to finish this just
Okay,
so people can get it, screenshot it? And did you have any images you wanted to share? Or
Yeah.
why don't you show us the images?
Trying to get there.
Thanks.
Okay, just to prove that you can do nebula with an unmodified camera, there's M42. I have a modified D750 that I did narrowband, H alpha and O3. You can do nice nightscapes with an unmodified Milky Way, looking at Avon, Hatteras Island. You can do the sun and the moon very well. You can do galaxies with a little bit of effort, and it's quite good for comets. Okay, now I'm done, Michael.
Oh, those are great images. So just so we're clear, all of those were with unmodified except for the H alpha at the top center?
The Heart Nebula and this solar image happened to be with my modified. The prominences were very nice, but everything else was unmodified.
Yeah, those are spectacular. So that, just to give you an idea, I mean, you probably don't have a picture without the modified, but I would imagine that one would not show much detail with an unmodified camera. Is that right?
It's yes. Unfortunately, I looked in my library. I didn't have anything that was a side-by-side with the same conditions, but you can find them on the internet easily enough.
Sure. So Michael, or Mike, did you want to add to what Jay's saying?
Yeah, all I wanted to say is, in reference to my email earlier in the week for beginners, is that, when I first started imaging in the club, there was only 2 or 3 of us that actually imaged. Everyone else was visual. And I started out with a Canon T2i, and excuse me, it worked very well. And then somebody said, well, you should get this guy, Gary Honus, who doesn't do it anymore, he retired, to modify the camera to remove the infrared filter in front of the sensor, because that would really make a big difference. And for $180, I think, if I remember correctly, I did that, and it made a huge difference. The reason I was pointing beginners toward DSLRs is that, it's hard when you're going to try to convince your husband or wife that you want to spend $1,000 on a dedicated astro camera that costs as much as a 50-inch LED widescreen TV. You really have to sell it. So
Oh yeah, I understand, Michael, but
And-
obviously we're dealing with adults here, so I'm assuming people can figure out what their budget is and use that information accordingly, right?
Well, sure, but
So-
most family arguments are over money, right?
So yeah,
And how
we're
it's
trying
spent.
to present, I think Jay did a good job kind of
Oh, yeah.
presenting the case.
Oh, I'm a big fan. I have a modified, I do more terrestrial photography than astro, and I do a lot of infrared photography. And a camera like a modified DSLR that you can use for astro is great for doing infrared photography. And if people out there have an itch to do something else besides astro, they've got a camera that basically is not just dedicated for doing one thing. And that's all I'm saying. It's just a lot of money. And if you're going to start out, see if you like it. If you catch the bug, start throwing money into it. That's all I was trying to say.
No, that's a good point. Certainly,
It doesn't need to be complicated.
as we've said, yeah, many times here, use what you have, and also, try to get experience before you really invest money, because the hobby is certainly not for everyone. It's very challenging. So you need to figure that out before you spend an arm and a leg on it. So,
And if you want to use a modified DSLR for dual purpose, I recommend Canon, because they have clip-in filters that allow you to get your white balance back up for terrestrial photography.
okay, let me move on to Mark, because again, let's try to keep the focus a little more for someone starting out. So there are some details that they'll obviously want to understand about these cameras once they get invested in them. But right now, just trying to give people an overview, kind of a survey of what the different things can do. And this image you have here, Jay, is wonderful for that. It really gives an impression of what a DSLR is capable of. And that's really what hopefully people will take away about DSLRs. So if you could let Mark share the screen now.
Let's see, stop share.
Mark Lang is going to talk about well, it's sort of like a DSLR, because his camera has a sensor that is in a Nikon DSLR, but it's in a body that is cooled. So it will blow any DSLR away from that alone. So are you ready, Mark?
I'm ready. You want me to share now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm just going to share the screen where I got some slides here.
And just remember, we're kind of targeting about 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah.
If that's not a
Shouldn't be
problem. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hold this up. This is my ASI 294. I know it's dark in here. I hope everybody can see it, but it's a fairly compact camera. Hold this up. Let me move this up where I can see it a little bit better. So I'm kind of an old school astrophotographer. And this is the setup that I use to do it. I carry this setup out every time I, go out and do astrophotography in my front driveway, right next to the street. So does my pointer show up when I do this? Can you guys see me moving my pointer?
No.
Okay. Anyway, at the end of my Genesis refractor there, everybody can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. At the end of my Genesis refractor is the ASI 294. And so I have that sitting out next to my computer. And so I sit out there and I image with everything right by me. I don't go in the house mostly. And I'm kind of hands-on with the thing the whole time. And I have a little guide scope, a 60mm guide scope with an ASI 120 at the top. But I had been doing CCD astrophotography for at least 10 years, starting around 2007. And so I had an SBIG ST402 with a color filter wheel on it. So I'm definitely familiar with the mono and the, put the filter in front of each channel. But I wanted to do some more sensitive one-shot color astrophotography. And so I had started looking at different color cameras for a while. And I started looking back then at the ASI 1600 MC, which is the one-shot color version of that, which is no longer made. And there weren't a lot of choices, back when I first got my camera. I've had it now. I've had the ASI 294 for about a year and a half, and I've had a ball with it. And I'd recommend I'd recommend it to anybody that's interested in moving up from a DSLR to a one-shot color dedicated CCD camera. It costs about $1,000, $999, but oftentimes you can find that ZWO will put their cameras on sale around Christmas time for about $100 off. Now, I'm not sure if they're still doing that or not, but it's a good time to take advantage of it if you are. The camera itself, let me move to the next slide here. This is the back of the camera. So there's a USB port, the blue thing that you hook the camera up to.
Mark, at least on my screen, it didn't change.
It didn't change. If it didn't change, I'm in trouble here.
Well, we saw the first one. I don't know. Zoom seems a little flaky to me, to be quite honest. But did everyone else see the next frame, or is it just
no?
me?
Just the Genesis refractor.
Right, that's all I can see.
Any change now?
No.
No.
Let me try this as an idea.
Yeah, we share images during the meetings. We don't seem to have issues.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
Are you sharing your screen or your app?
I was just sharing the one app.
Try sharing your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, I ended up doing that.
So
yeah, sharing your screen works much, much better in Zoom.
Okay, let me try this. How do when I do that, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right,
See
now,
that sunrise or beginning of it.
now can you see the picture of the back of the camera?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Really
you need to
small.
double click on it, but yeah, we see it.
Thumbnail, yeah.
Okay, see, I've got a full screen here, and I'm not sure.
You're using 2 monitors?
Yes,
Yeah, it depends on which one you were sharing.
let me try.
It only lets you share one monitor.
Let me try that. How's that?
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So the back of the camera has got a spot for the USB 3 interface that runs the camera, but also a USB 2 hub to run your guide scope probably and something else. And it's also got a connection for the cooler. So when you buy the camera, you want to run the cooler, you're going to have to buy a little transformer to run the cooler. It's a 12-volt thing. It's inexpensive, but you can use that. Let's see, go on. So why did I decide to buy the 294? So I had a modified DSLR, but it wasn't as sensitive as I was hoping. So one of the things that I wanted to do to make it better is try to decide, on a good camera that matched my typical equipment, which was that 4-inch f5 refractor with 500 millimeter focal length. So this camera has got a 4/3 size sensor. Can you guys see that down there, the 4/3? And it has 4144 by 2822 pixels. And it was kind of important to me that the pixel size was 4.6 microns because I wanted to use it with 500 millimeters and above. I didn't need teeny tiny pixels. And so the camera itself is an 11.3 megapixel camera. Also, the thing that I really liked about this camera at the time, again, at the time I bought this 1.5 years ago, the choices weren't what they are today. But the ADC, the analog to digital converter in this camera, gave 14 bits worth of depth. So you could get a lot more differentiation in the levels of gray or color. It also had good cooling, 35 degrees below ambient. And it's a USB camera. And when I also decided to get it, Don Duhart, another member of our club in the imaging group, he had previously bought one a few months before me, and he was having good success with his. And I had had my eye on this for a while. And so after he bought his and I saw what he was doing with his, I decided that might be a good choice for me to try. Another thing that helped me decide on this particular camera was, as Jay mentioned, Astro Backyard, the YouTube channel Astro Backyard. He had a nice video review of his ASI 294, and he spoke highly of it. And Trevor Jones, who runs that, is he's really good, and I kind of respect what he had to say. So that kind of sealed it for me, and so I ended up getting the ASI 294. All right, can you guys see that? It's a graph?
Yes.
Okay, so anyway, this camera has got a pretty high quantum efficiency, about 75%. And the blue and the green channels are about the same. I'm sorry, the red and the green channels are about the same, but the blue channel is a little less. So the images are going to be a little, red and green. Also, most importantly, at the graph down at the bottom, it shows, you can see that the gain, when you turn the
294.
Yeah, this is ASI 294. When you set the gain at 120, the read noise goes way down from the lower settings and stays pretty consistently good past that. So I typically run my camera at gain 120. Don typically runs his camera at gain 150, and we both get really good results with that. And typically, you know, I'm taking all my photography at home now. I haven't been out to Big Woods in quite a while. And so this camera does a good job for me at home. So Mike asked me if I kind of show a little bit about how I process the one-shot color pictures. So I use PixInsight. And so I use this weighted batch pre-processing script. And you put in your light frames that you took. Put in your flat frames that you took, and you put in your dark frames. And then you let this batch pre-processing script crunch on them for a while, and it'll turn out, excuse me, it'll turn out a nice, nice image for you. In this particular screenshot, I was trying to show here that I shoot dark frames for the length of the light frames, which is in this case the 60-second darks. But I also shoot dark frames for my flats. So I don't shoot bias. I shoot flats, and whatever time the flats were, I shoot a dark that matches the flat. And then I shoot the darks for the light frames. And then you have to show a little checkbox on the right-hand side. You have to say, you know, this is a color filter array camera, CFA. And pretty much the batch pre-processing script does all the work for you. And so this is a picture that after you get the batch pre-processing script done, it shows the flat frame field. I'm showing the flat frame field in the front so that you can, so that calibrated out the optical differences from the, that your camera and your optical assembly was doing. But it also, this is an example at the top left-hand corner of the bright spot that is from the camera. You know, it generates, you know, noise. And when you take a light frame and a matching dark frame, you can see that that dark frame has, you know, white noise up there in the top right-hand corner. That's subtracted away, and it's just not a factor at all.
Hey, Mark, this is Don. I've read that they recommend running the flat exposure at 2 to 3 seconds with this camera, and I really haven't noticed a difference. If I run like 0.7 seconds or 2 to 3.
Yeah, Don, I think it you know, ultimately matters is how bright is your light source on your flat frames too. So if you've got a real bright flat maker, then it would make a difference. If you know, I have mine so that I adjust it down to a pretty low light level so I can get longer flats.
I think part of that is just so that it'll compensate for the readout rate, this progressive scan rate, not a brain cramp. I can't remember the term where it takes all the light at once across the chip. Instead, it reads down the chip. And so if you try to take something too quickly, it can change from top to bottom.
Yes, yes. So back to the slide here. In the bottom left-hand corner, the really blue-looking frame is what the the picture looks like after the batch pre-processing scripts gets done with the combination of the of the light frames, and it has a distinct dark blue color for me because of the color that my flat maker is generating. After you run the automatic background extractor, ABE, it turns it into the picture you see at the top right-hand color, the top right-hand portion of the screen. So it turns it into a natural color picture with linear gradients removed out of it. And then I'm using the tool down there at the bottom to automatically set the exposure.
That looks good, Mark. Did you have any other pictures you wanted to show?
Yep.
Cool.
Finally, one quick thing here. You take the transform and turn it into a TIFF file, and then I send it into Photoshop. And after I mess with Photoshop, this is the picture that I got out. So this was a 60-second. This was it was 18 by 60 seconds unguided. It was the last time I was out at Big Woods, about a year ago. So this is Lagoon and the Trifid. It's turned over on its side, but I was really pleased with it at the time. This is M13 from home. This is 17 by 30 seconds. So you can really, you can really do some work even in, the light polluted part of Cary. And here's a picture of M95, M96, and a couple of the other galaxies, M105, 45 seconds each. And then finally, this is the Pac-Man Nebula. I bought one of the Optolong L-E enhanced filters to shoot narrowband through color, through a color filter array kind of deal. And this is 20 by 3 minutes exposures to get a pretty good, narrowband photo of the Pac-Man Nebula. So that's what I had, unless there are questions.
So just to repeat, so Mark is using a one-shot color camera. It is cooled, and I think that's part of the advantage he's had here is he's been shooting these in the summer, but since that camera is cooled, it benefits from a really low noise level. But yeah, you can see even in, so I'm assuming, Mark, you don't see the Milky Way in your yard at all. And what do you say?
No, I can see a hint of it sometimes, but when it's a good clear night.
So not the brightest place, but certainly typical of a suburban location. So this gives you an idea of what you might be able to do, even if you do have some light pollution. You don't live out in the country. So,
hey Mark, what portal number would you say your sky is?
Don, I don't know, but on the last map that I saw, it's certainly in the red zone.
Oh, really?
I'm going to agree. I don't live too far from Mark and Cary. Where we're at, it's definitely in the red zone in Cary.
Oh, wow. So that means it's probably like a border of 8 or something like that, 7.
Yeah. So you can do some good work there. Now, I need to move to David. He's I think he's going to have another obligation soon. So let's get to David. He's going to talk about the 183 monochrome camera he uses.
Bear with me here. I need to figure out how to share my entire screen here. It should. Let's see what happens. Okay, can anybody see my desktop?
Yes.
And now you can see PixInsight. Okay, hang on a second, I need to move the Zoom thing. All right, Michael asked me to talk about the ASI 183 and the ASI 071. Let me give you guys something to look at here. So for those that are beginners and are not real familiar with the ZWO numbers, up until a few months ago, your options for a monochrome camera that was cooled from ZWO was the ASI 1600 and the ASI 183. And since that time, they've come out with two more. One is a full frame sensor, the ASI 6200, which is about $4,000, I think. And then they have a brand new one that is confusingly enough called the ASI 294mm, even though it uses a different sensor than the color camera that Mark Lang was just discussing. In this particular case, I've had both the ASI 1600 and the ASI 183. So there's a couple of differences between these cameras I'll go through real quick. The ASI 1600 has a bigger sensor. Slightly, it's not a huge difference. For those that are beginners, I would encourage you to learn the website astronomytools.com, which allows you to compare field of view for different cameras through your telescope against common astronomical objects. So you can get kind of an idea. And like most other things, it's a question of how big a field of view you want versus the amount of money you wish to spend. Smaller chips are generally cheaper. Cooled chips or cooled cameras are generally tack on about $300 or $400 onto the base camera in ZWO's world. In the case of the 183, it is available as a color camera, a mono camera, and as cooled and uncooled versions of both of those. What you see on your screen here is a shot of the Leo triplet that I made from a very dark place in Louisa, Virginia. This is about, I believe, about 8 hours of data. And as you would expect, since this is LRGB, this was separate luminance, separate red, separate green, and separate blue filters. As Michael noted, there is something that you have to think about when you're using a mono camera with filters. And that is, if you have gone somewhere because you live in a light polluted location like I do, LRGB from a light polluted location is extremely difficult. In my particular case, at my house, I estimate the sky quality as about Bortle 2. Excuse me, I'm sorry, the other way around. Bortle 8, 7 or 8, which works out to a intensity of about 18 magnitude per square arc second. Big Woods is about 20, kind of depends on the night. And the place that I took this from is about 21.9, so it's quite dark. But the bottom line here is this is a cooled version of the 183 mono, and I would not have been able to do this with the uncooled version of the 183. The 183, and as is the case with most of the CMOS cameras, thermal noise affects them a great deal more than CCDs. And the good news is, if you've got reasonable cooling on your camera, below about 5 degrees Celsius below zero, the thermal noise drops off to almost nothing. But if anyone here that's got a little more experience has ever forgotten to connect the cooler for their camera and shot with one of these cameras, the thermal noise is horrendous. So I guess the bottom line I would say about this, if you are someone that is new to this, does not have a camera, or thinking about buying a astrophotography camera, if you intend to take long exposure photographs, like of galaxies and emission nebula and things like that, I would strongly encourage you to save your pennies and buy a cooled camera. As Michael might get into a little more when he shows his pictures or whatever, if you're just buying it for planetary work, then it really isn't necessary to have cooling. But if you think you're going to do this, buy a cooled camera. So that is, like I said, a picture of the Leo triplet taken with 183. The other thing I wanted to show you is, I believe it's this one. Okay, this is a single sub from that particular location. I believe this was, yeah, this was 2 minutes. And for those that are beginners, this is what you typically see as a single frame. And you get the final thing that you just saw by combining a whole ton of these. What I wanted to show you, Mark actually mentioned this, it's a little bit hard to see on this, but you can see if you look closely, an area here where there's a bit of a starburst pattern. This is something that is very familiar to those that use CMOS cameras. It's called amplifier glow. And all of your individual frames, which we call subs, will have this amplifier glow in it. And that is why you must use calibration frames to remove that out. The calibration frame in this case is just covering the camera and taking the same length of exposure with no light hitting the sensor. That will still have the amplifier glow, and then you subtract that out in software. But at any rate, I just wanted to explain that this is the case. This factors into what I just said about a cooled camera. The amplifier glow gets considerably worse the warmer the camera temperature is. And in this particular camera, if you forget to connect your cooler to 12 volts, so the camera is not cooled and you're running at maybe 10 degrees Celsius or maybe even 25 degrees Celsius in the middle of the summer, that amplifier glow would stretch all the way across the screen. So that's kind of the basics of the amplifier glow for the 183. One advantage of the 183 that it has over the ASI 1600, there's two of them. One of them is it has an anti-reflection coating on the window over the chip, which is why this particular star, and Mark Lang could probably tell us what star this is, but I'm not familiar with it. But it would be rather ugly image of this star if I had taken this with the ASI 1600, because it does not have an anti-reflection coating on the chip itself.
Hey, that star's not nearly bright enough to be a problem, but anyway.
Okay, well, anyway.
I'll show you my images.
Yeah, I was going to say, you can show Alnatac, they'll get the
yes.
idea. That does not mean the ASI 1600 is not worth using. I don't want to give people that implication. It's just that the 183 is different in that respect. There are some folks on cloudy nights that are anal retentive as hell and absolutely cannot tolerate the, people call them star trumpet effect on really bright constellation stars. I'm not in that camp. Doesn't really bother me that much, but that is one of the differences. The 183 is more sensitive than the 1600 camera by about, what is it, Mark? Mike, it's about 30% roughly. This one's 80. And
I think it just compensates for the pixels being smaller, so it ends up being a wash, I think.
Yeah, it might be. Anyway, but that is one of the differences, because at least as a beginner, if you're going to go with a mono camera, you've really at this point got kind of the lower end cost aspect of this, which would be the 183s and the 1600s, or the much higher cost, which is the full frame ASI 6200. And I'm sorry, Michael, I don't remember what the 294 mono is.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's about $1,500 if I remember, but
yeah.
Do you remember?
No, I don't.
Anyway.
Do you have some more 183 images? We might skip to 071 because I think Arjun's going to talk about.
I'm about to do it. Actually, I only have
Okay.
these images. Mainly because I destroyed my directory structure and can't find a lot of the images. Okay, so what you're seeing here is Markarian's chain taken with an ASI 071. This is about 9 hours. This is a quick and dirty process before I actually did it while we were at Manchester's for one of the imaging meetings. So this is, yes, the frames are calibrated, but this is no background neutralization and no gradient removal. In this particular case, the ASI 71 has a little bit of amplifier noise. That's what you see right here and right here. And the reason you see it in this frame, even though it was calibrated, is because I goofed and didn't set the camera at the correct temperature when I was taking darks for this particular image. But the point here is that the amplifier glow that is there is not structured. It doesn't have a starburst pattern like you saw on the 183, and a little bit less obnoxious. The ASI 071 has a bigger pixel than the 183. I'm sorry, I don't remember right off the top of my head. I think it's about 4.5 microns. But it is a front side illuminated chip, which means that it is less sensitive. So that's why this one is about, like I said, about 9 hours, I believe, something like that on Markarian's chain. And this was also shot from the same location in Louisa, Virginia. Finally, one last comment, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Michael. This is the lunar eclipse of January 2019. The reason I wanted to show this was taken with the ASI 071, is that you'll notice that there's actually stars in this frame. This is not a combined image where I've taken a whole bunch of frames and combined them and played some Photoshop tricks so that I could see the stars. This is actually a result of the large full well count of the ASI 071. It's about 50,000. And some of the mono cameras like the ASI 1600 and the 183 will have much smaller full counts, so they have less dynamic range. What that means is that if you took an image of this with one of those cameras, then you would not see the stars because the moon is gigantically brighter than the stars. So like I said, that's another consideration, and I'm aware if you're a beginner, then there's a confusing mess of all of that as far as considerations. But at any rate, the ASI 071 has a pretty big full count, and I believe Mark Lang's 294 does as well. And sometimes under certain situations that benefits you, like when you're trying to capture a large dynamic range between a really bright object and a not so bright object. So that's it, Michael.
Thanks,
turn it
David.
over to you unless somebody has questions that they need to ask about this.
So I'll just summarize. So the 183 he has is a monochrome cooled camera, and the 071 is a one-shot cooled camera.
Sorry,
And,
should have said that.
Yep, and you can see it's quite a capable camera. So right now I'm going to switch over to Doug and Mike. Or Mike? I don't know. They're going to speak about EAA, or one of them will. So I guess you need to let go of your screen, David.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Thanks
so
again.
I'm going to defer to Mike first, and then.
Sorry,
Okay.
I am completely clumsy when it comes to. I was able to turn it on. All right, there we go. Turned it off.
Thank you.
Okay. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, just some very quick comments. You should be seeing my screen come through any moment now.
Yep.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, the first one I'll say is, a lot of people have, trouble defining EAA. In fact, it raises quite a few arguments, especially on cloudy nights. And what I'll say is these are my opinions. But you have traditional visual observing, and then you have kind of astrophotography. And what EAA is doing is using imaging. So we are using an imager to try to do a little bit of both. There are a lot of similarities across the board. EAA is really not about the equipment or even the process that you're using. So whatever, a lot of people will say, oh, that's not EAA because you're using this or you're not using that. And really, it ultimately is about what is your intent. Is your intent to do viewing real time, I just want to see something with a little bit more detail than I can through an eyepiece? Or do you want to save a whole bunch of data for later processing that will make an absolutely beautiful work of art? Again, if it's about the real-time viewing, that's EAA. And as Michael mentioned earlier, it's not a this or that, but it can be an and, because you can save the data for later. The equipment requirements are definitely not as demanding as traditional astrophotography, or we can call that long exposure. I will say that alt azimuths are more than adequate to start out for your purposes. You don't need a computer, but you will need some sort of monitor unless you're using a night vision device. EAA does encompass using a night vision device on an eyepiece, but I have no experience in that, so can't really talk about it. But a computer is a very valuable asset. And this is where we start talking about the many similarities between long exposure astrophotography and what we do for EAA. So many of the software packages that you'll use, I actually really like SharpCap. That's my default go-to application. But using a computer allows you to do a much better job stacking. It allows you to align frames. It takes care of field rotation. The software allows me to try and get really good focus. And it also does dark subtraction. So you can use a lot of those same processes that you're going to use for astrophotography in EAA. I definitely will recommend using a cooled camera to improve your pictures. And more than anything, for me, it's the lazy way out, because I know that if I'm using a cooled camera and I'm doing that dark subtraction, I have a nice library already set up for basically -10 degrees Celsius. So I only have to have one library of darks that has all the different gains and all the different exposure values that I use for dark subtraction. So for me, my camera can pretty much, even in, or at least in the summertime that I've tried to do EAA, I can get the camera down to 10, -10. So definitely a cooled camera absolutely helps a lot, keeps your pictures cleaner. You definitely want to look for a color or a one-shot color camera. And this is because, again, you're trying to view it real time. I suppose you could use a mono camera, but then your pictures will be mono. I've heard of people trying to use a filter wheel to stack and do real time. I imagine that's got to be a little bit more difficult, but again, it's possible. And some of the very popular cameras that are being used now are the ZWO line of cameras, as well as many of the other ones. But it's really the Sony chips. The 224, the IMX 224 chip, was a real game changer in that it was such a low read noise camera that it really propelled EAA a long ways. The 385, which is what I use, I don't know if that comes through, my 385, cooled. It's basically the big brother to the 224. Very, very similar statistics and what do you call it, specs on it. It's just a bigger sensor. The 294 is very popular as well. I've started to read more about the 533 camera. I'm thinking about that as a possibility, as well as the 1600. So you see a lot of these are very similar to what, basically long exposure cameras that are being used. A lot of these come in both mono and in color versions. Malincam it's a very popular name within the video astronomy and EAA area. They also sell some complete turnkey kits, and they'll get you in an RC scope with the camera, with the monitor. I mean, you can buy kind of an entire kit with that. They do claim that they specifically select and are very particular about which sensors they use. That is a source of great debate online, whether there is anything that they are doing to these cameras, or are they just reselling something. Definitely won't get into that now, but you'll find varied opinions online about that. And then there's also something called the Revolution Imager, and that is a company that uses traditional CCD chips in what they're doing. And it's very similar to my now defunct, I don't know if that will come in with my background, but let's see if I can do it. There we go. Wow, that really doesn't do a very good job. But this is basically a modified security camera that was once sold by a now out of business company, and it can be done. You can, and I'm going to jump forward here. Come on, jump forward. All right, looks like that one doesn't want to switch. Okay, so again, these older CCD cameras are actually more sensitive. So they'll acquire an image much faster than the CMOS cameras, like the ZWOs that I was using. But they have lower resolution. So this is a standard TV, standard PAL or PAL configuration camera. So you're looking at 640 pixels across by 480 pixels down. So again, not really a high resolution. It won't fill your monitor screen, but super, super fast acquisition time and very, very sensitive. But I personally wanted better pictures. I wanted to see a little bit more. I didn't like some of the graininess, and it was also very hard to find software that would control the actual camera itself. So used to have a cable to feed and the computer. So that was an audio cable that went to a frame grabber. So it was going digital to analog back to digital. I had to have a camera had to have a cable to provide power, and then I had to have a third cable to actually do remote control of the camera, because you didn't want to be sitting here trying to push the buttons on the back of this camera, which would just impart a bunch of motion into what you were doing. So it was a bit more of a rat's nest of cables versus the newer CMOS. Again, this is truly cooled. This one had a little fan up top on it. Probably can't, maybe that I can see it. So it had a fan blowing something in there. I can't really tell you what kind of cooling that is. But the newer CMOS cameras, again, you've got a lower read noise than the old CCDs. You've got the USB control. You can get basically software packages that can completely control the camera. Again, they're not as sensitive, so you have slower acquisition. So in this view that I'm showing of the Eagle Nebula, the smaller picture, which is the older version, that is in essence, it's a little under 20 seconds of complete acquisition, and that's what I saw on my screen, versus the larger, fuller view of the Eagle Nebula down below. That is about 4 to 5 minutes, I have to go back, of constant acquisition. The older methodology was it would always average out 5 frames, and it would always, or 5 captures, or integrate them, and it would always drop one and add a new one, drop one and add a new one. So all I could do was 20 seconds all at once. Down below, it would just continue to stack and continue and continue and continue until I was happy with the view. I will pause. Doug, you want to jump in at all? If there's anything you share, I'm going to show a few other examples, and you're on mute.
Yeah, yes, it's interesting that you guys are back talking to the CCD cameras. I started off with a CCD camera. This little guy called the KP. Maybe you can see it on my screen there. Anyway, with this guy right here, it actually has a fairly large chip in it for a CCD coming from. Has a fairly large CCD chip in it, and it's pretty forgiving, and it does great video off the back of the LX200. Again, it's pretty forgiving. But the problem is, if you look at the back, there's no intelligence. So it's all analog switch, or it's all switches. So if you want to change your frame rate or anything like that, it's really difficult. And so it's really difficult to get good exposure with it. But it has been a great camera. When it comes to the point where I share my screen, I'll show something from it. But it's like Mike said. I mean, they're faster. They're very forgiving. And so you can get an image really quick with that. So that's all I wanted to say about the CCD, or since that kind of touched a nerve that you were on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That you found that the CCDs were more sensitive. I wonder if it's the pixel size, because sensitivity in a given amount of time is directly proportional to the area of the individual pixels, all other things being equal.
And definitely, here's a little bit better shot, hopefully, of that sensor size. It's pretty good size. It's really good. This was actually a research camera we had from a company that I worked for that actually went under. But it's also, you can buy this camera. It usually was easily in the $800 range. Now you can buy it for about $35. So, again though, I mean, you really want to get something that you can control software.
Yeah, I would definitely say that the pixels were definitely bigger. I don't remember the exact configuration on this one, but I think it was like, 5 to 7 microns wide. It was a weird. I know it wasn't I don't understand it, but if my memory serves me correctly, it wasn't a square pixel. It was more somewhat rectangular. But again, I could be just misremembering. But it was somewhere 5 or 7 microns versus I know that my ASI 325 385 is, I want to say 3.76 microns square. So it definitely does improve it, but again, you do get the blockier stars. But even when you start to look at the kind of CCD to CMOS, almost trying to get the same sort of same specs and size, it just seemed that the older CCDs just were more sensitive and faster, but again, a much higher read noise, which again limits you for EAA. At least that's kind of what the general consensus is. I am by no means any sort of engineer that can talk to the pros and cons of this. This is really just what I've experienced and kind of what I have gotten in the general consensus from cloudy nights. So again, you can always be swayed by some interesting information on those sites.
So you said you had a few examples you were showing?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, cool.
So this is an example of the Sculptor Galaxy. And again, just to go back up to this one, I mean, I'm not going to win any prizes. None of these are going to get to the, be published in Sky and Telescope magazine, but that's not their purpose. But at the same time, I saw that. No one with an 11-inch scope is going to be able to see this. From their eyepiece. I don't care how dark of a sky you get, you're not going to see the Eagle Nebula like this. So again, it's about observing real time, and hey, this makes for a great Facebook picture. Pardon the dust bunnies, I have cleaned those out, but this was the Sculptor Galaxy. Again, this is just what I saw in about 3 minutes with my scope. So you can pick up some great detail of the kind of dust lanes and other objects within the galaxy. I will say that I am using focal reduction, so we've got quite a bit of, at the edges, this isn't great. Again, I'm also using an SCT and this rectangular shaped sensor. So again, you've got definitely some, it's not great out at the edges. We've also got, this is actually going on. This is a picture taken from, again, with this camera. In this scenario, I'm actually using my doublet. So in many cases, and by the way, this is Alan Attack. If anyone doesn't know, we've got the Flame Nebula and the Horus Head. Lots and lots of chromatic aberration here. Still, this is one when I haven't cleaned up the dust bunnies. So again, not going to win any awards for the beauty of this picture. But when you can look at that and say in 5 minutes or less, and this is what I saw, hey, you're not going to see the visual, the horse head visually from, this is, by the way, Jordan Lake, and you're not going to see it through a 4-inch reflector, but yet here it is from that perspective. And then lastly, again, this I believe is also through my, I think this is also through my reflector. Again, nice chromatic aberration, but this is of the Orion Nebula. So I almost love the 3D effect you get. And this was, I want to say, this is less
How
than
long
3
were you
minutes.
live stacking the horse head?
Pardon?
How long were you accumulating on the horse head?
I rarely will do anything over 5 minutes. This is probably somewhere between 3 and 4.
Okay.
Same thing. Yeah, I rarely do over 5. I just, by the time, you can definitely gather more information and improve it, but usually in EAA, at least my experience with my equipment, once you're beyond that 3 to 4 minute mark, you're really not improving the image anymore. The fact that I may have captured more only means that I got up to grab a cup of coffee or did something, or went to go tap someone on the shoulders, hey, come and take a look at this. So you really don't see the improvement after 3 to 4 minutes. So I will stop sharing, and Doug, if you want to share.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Sure. Wow, Doug, that looks really familiar. Your background picture.
Yeah, I didn't steal it from you. That's actually mine.
I'm not saying you did. It's just funny.
Yeah, let me share my screen, and then I'll start the slide show real quick. And I don't have much to show. I do, Michael. By the way, I really appreciate your discussion on the f6.3 focal reducer. It's really important to do that. So yeah, definitely great, great advice. Why is my share? Can anyone see my? You can see this screen.
I see your
You can see
background.
your desktop.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So mine is starting now.
But while Doug's pulling that up, I will say that, this is a great way to dip your toe into the hobby. And is it, is EAA a gateway drug to astrophotography? Way to start without having to, because I think a lot of people that will answer questions about what I should get. So many times you have people saying, well, I just want to take pictures. And oftentimes those of us that have a bit more experience assume that they want to do full-blown astrophotography. And when they say, well, I've got this camera and this mount, and they tell you, no, you can't do it. Well, you can if you do EAA, but you're right, to do true long exposure astrophotography, that, that as mount, or, even that Nexstar 8 on a wedge isn't going to cut it. And you're right, it's not going to cut it for 5-minute exposures, but for 10-second exposures, it will.
Good point. Yeah. So Doug, give us some examples of your cameras and what you've been doing. That'd be great. Thanks.
So yeah, this is the first one I was showing you guys. So this is where I started off with this, like in about 2001, using this guy, and it's a good little planetary camera. It's great. Again, it's really hard to set the exposures on some of these. So, but I did get to use it as a good lunar camera, and you can kind of see the X right there, kind of going out of way. So that was great for a while. Then I kind of went up to the ASI 120. It's got a really small sensor, and of course, it's much better now as a guide camera. But I did go with that. About the best thing I got was this little set of this little guy, NGC 6196. I got that. It's kind of hard to see that in there, but it's not. That's about the best deep sky shot I got with it. Then I kind of went up to the MC 178 MC cooled. It's no longer on the market. It has a little bit bigger sensor in it. But I will tell you, where David Keller kind of came off with is that, with using, I actually took this with an ST80, not my SCT. So both these shots came off my ST80. And I really find that the ST80 is much easier to image with than the SCT. So I don't mean to diss the SCT because it's a great visual scope. But yeah, it's I've really found that the ST80 is better. I hate to tell you that, but the more I get to, I actually have not been able to work with this that much due to school and then COVID. I mean, work and then COVID and everything. But I hope to, once the weather clears, to get out and do a little more. I do want to say one thing really quick about the focal reducers. If you buy them from Mead, you can't hardly see that against my background. There's two different kinds. One made in Japan and the other made in China, and there are no part numbers or identifying serial numbers or whatsoever from that. You want to get the ones made in China. I'm sorry, in Japan. Don't get the one in China because it has a shorter focal length. And so that might be good for photography, but it's not good for visual. And this one, which is made in Japan, is really good for both visual and for photography. So I like to have something a little more versatile. So just keep that in mind. The final two, I just got this, the QHY 163. It has a much bigger sensor. I don't really have any photos to share with that, but it's because I haven't had it that long. But once I get to a better site or get to get out and use it, I plan on making more images with it. It's a much better camera. It's cooled, has a much bigger sensor, a bit faster. So I'm looking forward to using it. And finally, I'm just going to kind of give a shout out to this little. Also with EAA, it's this little Nex XY. You can take some pretty decent shots with this guy. The one I have right here on the left, of course, is NeoWise. I took that right off the eyepiece projection, right off the ST80. And the other one here is Moon and Mars. And of course, I think, of course, Steve has a really fantastic shot of this with another 35 millimeter lens. You took that with, right? But anyway, this really came off of, setting it right down into the ST80 and taking the shot. So, I mean, there's a lot, I guess, on a shoestring, I mean, this only costs about maybe $75, and you just take your Plaza and use that. The QHY is a little more expensive, but the other ones, especially the ASI 120, it's pretty cheap. You can get that if it's for under 200, just if you wanted to start out with something. So that's really all I have to say.
Thank you, Doug.
Doug, actually, what is that adapter that you have there? What was it called?
It's the Nex XYZ, I think it is.
Nex XYZ.
Yeah, let me see. I'm still sharing my screen. I'll pull this over here. Can you guys see that? Right here. And it's really cute. You can, like I said, I would just, you could probably just take a dedicated Plaza and put that on there, and just keep it, and you just drop it into your eyepiece. That way it's always in focus. This little tray right here is where your cell phone goes.
So that's an eyepiece that's already like in it.
Right, that's an eyepiece that's already in it. Exactly.
Oh, okay.
But it doesn't come with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the box.
Is there? It's Celestron, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Yeah, you can see the symbol. Is there Android or Apple software available to do the same sorts of things, so you can go straight into your phone and put that on your system? Like this adapter, you only have it live stack.
Well, there are things that allow you longer exposures and multiple exposures on an iPhone at least. I can't remember what the software is called, but if you look it up.
One of the cool things you can do is that if you go ahead and install the Zoom app on your iPhone, you can join your Zoom chat on your iPhone, and then you can be transmitting your picture over your iPhone directly on Zoom chat. So that's also kind of but I haven't used anything that does any auto stacking or anything on the phone. That would be great.
Let's move on to Arjun, and I think we'll wrap things up with questions. Are you ready, Arjun?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Let's see.
Can I stop sharing?
I think if you stop, that'd be great, Doug. Thank you.
Oh, I see it. Never mind. My share bar is hitting. Hold on a second. My apologies. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I was just realizing I started this hobby about 2 years ago, but I probably can't call myself a beginner anymore. So by now, I still feel like I'm learning something every time I go out. So I'm gonna talk about some of the more advanced and more expensive cameras out there. I'll try to keep it short because the time is, we're pretty late. So. But these are kind of the more high-end cameras that you can buy from ZWO, because I like them and I ended up buying all of their stuff. A quick thing is that the cameras I'm talking about mostly are like the latest generation, and there's a lot of development in chips and CMOS technology, but it's mostly because of large mass market usage of imaging chips, like for phones, for DSLRs, right, of which they sell probably still millions, GoPro cameras, right, and security cameras. And astrophotography, right, ZWO maybe sells tens of thousands of cameras per year, not millions, right? So they're just using kind of consumer level technology and put it in the cameras, but they upgrade it with like cooling and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the latest technology now is, and that's kind of the difference with this generation from the previous one, is that now they use the backside illumination CMOS. So it actually has the image photo diode kind of up front, and the circuitry is behind the sensor, so more light can actually hit the sensor of the chip. There's a couple of cameras in this generation. The chips are all very similar. They just have very different names. So there's the 533 camera from ZWO. There's the 2600 and the 6200. And what the main difference is that the sensor size is much different and much larger. They have the same kind of pixel size, the same kind of deep well depth, and noise specifications and all that. But I think also what's interesting is that, and I'll show some examples, is that these cameras do not have amp glow anymore. So that circuitry that causes that, and I think I read somewhere today because I was reading up on that, is that it emits some kind of heat or IR radiation that just radiates out from the chip that's off the sensor, and that's causing that. So they finally found a way to kind of isolate that and put it off the side and not have it affect the image anymore. So that's great. You don't have to compensate for that anymore. And even I see people, and I don't subscribe to that, but I see people that do not use calibration frames anymore. So they don't do dark frames, and they don't have to compensate for this amp glow. It just they take the image out of the camera and it just works. So that's kind of sweet if that's good enough for you. So I made this kind of overview, and you can see kind of the sizes of the chip in these various cameras. And I made like a green little rectangle where you can see the difference in the sensor size, right? So even though these cameras are roughly the same size, I think the 533 is a bit smaller than the 2600 and the 6200. The sensor surface is way different and all that. The price also goes up tremendously, right? You go from the cheapest here is $899, and the most expensive one is $4,000. But then again, I was looking at the Canon R5, which is the top end Canon DSLR, and that's also $4,000. And sure, it's more capable of doing all kinds of imagery. It's not as capable doing astro. And for normal image taking, I generally don't use DSLRs. I just use my iPhone. So I'm like, this is just my dedicated camera for astro, and I want to have like the ultimate sensitivity and noise behavior and cooling and all that. I made this whole diagram, but you know, I'll just share it in the group for later, right? I think, you know, the pros and cons of all these different sensors. I think, you know, the interesting thing is, right, every camera has like pros and cons, but you know, it's either like the sensor is small or the sensor has like a low bit depth, so that's the smoothness or gradation of the signal, right? The amount of bits. Some of them have not enough well depth. That's like, you know, what, you know, it's, you know, a sensor is basically counting photons that come in and get converted to electrons, and it's a bit per pixel. There's a bucket, and the bucket will fill up, and at some point, when it's full, it will overflow, right, or it will stop counting, and that's kind of the well depth. So you kind of want to have a camera for many cases that has a deep well depth, so it could keep on counting while you're exposing more, right? And especially you want to get out the problem with these images is that their dynamic range is really big, right? Stars are like ultra bright, right? Like they're as bright as you can get, right? And they will overexpose really quickly. And the nebulosity is super faint, right? So the well depth, you need to get the dynamic range to see both the nebulosity and not have the stars turn into big blobs, right, on the screen. So yeah, I'll share that for later. It's a good reference if anybody has questions about this stuff and wants advice, right, ask me about it. So I'll do some comparisons between the different sensor sizes and all that. So this is a image from that astronomy.tools site, where it's really useful to compare your scope and compare your sensor, right? And what I did here is I have this little RAC lens. It's a 250 millimeter focal length, like almost like a camera lens. And you know, if you see the difference between the various sensors, you see how much more constrained the view becomes, right? The field of view is going to be much smaller. And you know, the 183, which is the red one, on the red cat will still capture Andromeda M31 very well in the frame with this combination. You know, so that works, but I think it's more applicable for Milky Way nebulosity type photography. So here I used a tool called Nina that Michael is a big fan of, and he's convinced me of using. So there's this imaging or framing wizard, and you can, you know, basically see how big your image or your sensor in your camera, your scope shows of the night sky. So I compared my 6200 camera with the 183 camera, right? And if you just go back and forth, right, the difference in field of view is really large. And what you can do to kind of get a larger field of view is either you use a different telescope or a different lens, right? Or you start doing a mosaic. And you know, to get the same size that a full frame sensor has with a 183, you almost need like 12 panels, so 12 different you know, exposures or multiple exposures, and combine them together to get the same kind of size and all that. I like monochrome cameras because of the heightened sensitivity, and especially since I'm mostly shooting or exclusively shooting from my driveway, I kind of want to kind of use the narrowband filter sets to kind of compensate out the street lights and the moon and that kind of stuff. But yeah, you know, the larger your camera becomes, or the sensor becomes, you know, the larger of a filter you need. So, you know, with the starting cameras like a 183 or a 533 and those kind of things, right? You can use like small size filters, like 1.125 inch. You know, with a 6200, I'm using 2-inch filters, which are already kind of a lot more expensive. But a lot of people are starting to use square filters, which are, you know, another step up in money. And you know, it's like any hobby, right? You can spend as much money as as you like or as you have. And this is certainly one of these things. Like, you know, yeah, it gets expensive if you want to get the full filters. But I find that with the 2-inch filters, I got like a slight fall off at the corners, but I can normally compensate that out really easily. I'm just trying to go fast. So, you know, I was like, you know, why did I pick the 2600, right? So I have most of these cameras and I still have them. But, you know, the 2600 I got like probably 6 months ago. And why did I pick it, right? So what I found is that with my previous camera, the 183, the lack of well depth caused the stars to saturate, and the stars became really big blobs easily. So the only way I could use that with my telescope is to take really short exposures, like 30 seconds or 60 seconds or something. So I wanted to kind of take a bit longer exposures, but also get a bit wider field of view. So yeah, the 2600 is a much larger sensor, and worked really well with the cameras that I had. And it's a color camera, but you can use, you know, the narrowband dual band filters to get both the oxygen 3 emission line and the hydrogen alpha emission line, and get, you know, pleasing pictures out of that. So that's basically the reason I got that one. I also have the 6200, which I got recently. So that was I had to think about it sometime, because that's an expensive one. But I'm really intrigued, especially, you know, in summertime, with the super large wide field views of like our galaxy and all that. And I noticed that actually a lot of the gear I have is actually able to support full frame sensors pretty well, right? So I use camera lenses, like a Canon 50mm lens, a 135mm Rokinon lens. I've got a GT 71. I got a Red Cat, an Edge, I think even works. I haven't tried that yet. And I also was thinking of upgrading my my main scope to a RAC 11, where it also really works well. You know, the camera, like it's in the overview, you know, has like the best specs on basically every point, right? It has the lowest noise, it has less micro lensing artifacts, it has the greatest well depth, it has the greatest bit depth. So I kind of just plunged to kind of the best camera I could buy. And you know, it's unfortunate because from you know, there are not that many mono sensors available because there's just no consumer demand for it, right? Nobody wants to buy a DSLR with a monochrome sensor. So it's a very specialist, you know, clientele that needs those kind of sensors. So there's not many monochrome sensors. So, you know, basically the 1600 or 294 are like the largest monochrome sensors you can get, and then it's the leap all the way to full frame. And we're kind of missing an in between there, the APS-C type sensor. But I'm hearing that the 2600, right, the step down from here, is going to get a monochrome version, hopefully at like half the price of the full frame. So that's going to be a really exciting camera when that comes out. You know, in a few months, I'm hearing. So that's going to be interesting.
You want to show us some examples with these cameras? That'd be great.
Yeah. So you know, AmpGlow, I think we've all talked about it, but I just ran my dark libraries that I have through the thing. So this is the 183. This is the 1600. You know, it's not the radiating things, but you see like small lighted corners, right? And then this is the 6200. There's like nothing, right? There's no AmpGlow whatsoever. There's some hot pixels, but they compensate out nicely. Examples. I'll just go through my examples, and then we can do questions maybe.
Yeah, that's great.
This is the 2600 with a dual band, right? Really wide field, right? Normally you see this target the Veil Nebula in like little elements, and this is just everything in one shot. This is the 2600 as well. I got the Comet with it, with I think the Red Cat, and I got the Crescent. That's nice. This is currently the first and only picture I have with the 6200. It's a really wide view on that Red Cat. You know, you get a lot of targets at once, and a lot of kind of, you know, the sensitivity that picks up all that nebulosity is quite amazing, right? Just to show, right, and this is not that camera. This is the 1600, etc. Right? When you combine these monochrome pictures, you know, and the different filters, you can make color pictures again, right? So, you know, these are the type of color pictures I was able to make when you make images through various filters. And yeah, you know, it's you know, 2 years ago I was watching Astro Backyard and I was amazed what he was doing, and now I think you know, my pictures are better than his sometimes. So I'm like, you know, it's cool to see.
Well, you've shot up the learning curve pretty quickly. You've mastered most of it, I think.
Yeah, I just have final slide. So, you know, it's about portability. So my portable scope actually uses not a DSLR, but uses a cooled camera as well. So this is what it looks like. It fits in a backpack, right? It uses the ASI Air. That's a little thingy up top to kind of control everything and control the mount and all that. But this one basically does full go-to. I type in the object and it will go to the object. It will do multiple exposures. It can do multiple stacking. You know, I can control it with my phone. So this is quite capable. And some of the shots I've shown, like the Comet and both these pictures are shot with this setup. So, you know, it's quite possible to make portable setups at really high quality with cooled cameras, cooled specialized cameras.
That's a good point. The tech has really moved along to the point you can do that now. Well, I'm going to move on to questions. I appreciate everyone who's contributed and is very informative, and I'm sure people will go back and watch this again and pick up different parts of it. But do we have any questions? Any of our viewers or newer users?
Yeah, this is Jim Toops. Is there any way to get copies of the slides you guys show?
Copies of all the presentations? Yeah,
the presentation, right.
Yeah, I'll ask everyone. I'm not sure how we usually store those. Do we put them on the groups.io or what can we do?
I think that's an option. I can double check. But yeah, that might be the best way to do it.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I don't know that we've been doing that traditionally, so we might take us a second.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, yeah. Don't do anything you don't normally do, but if there was an easy way to do it, some of those slides are very informative.
Yeah, we'll see what we can come up with. Thank you.
No problem.
Repository of things like that on the website.
I do have a question. Arjun, you showed, and unfortunately I had to take a phone call. I came in and you were showing the ASI 533, and just wasn't sure if you said anything about that camera, but that's literally, I'm thinking that might be my next EAA camera. I just haven't heard a lot about it. Do you have any specific thoughts or?
So I haven't used it myself, but it's the same exact sensor technology as the 2600 and the 6200 that I have. So it has no amp glow. It has super high well depth, right? I think it's only 14 bits instead of 16 bits. It's on that table. I'll share you the table in presentation. But yeah, I think if I would buy a color camera right now, a small one, I would definitely buy that one, you know, over a 183 MC, right? Because it's a much more friendly sensor to use.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I question Arjun. The potential 2600 mm. Do you know if that's going to be 1.25 inch or 2-inch filters?
I have to see. So there's a calculator somewhere. You can actually calculate how it works. It also depends on the F ratio of your scope. Hopefully you can use a 36 millimeter filter, which would be much more cost effective. But I can calculate it out, and I'll share it in the group. It's a good question. I'm also interested in that.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question for the EAA guys. If your polar alignment isn't quite right and you're getting field rotation as you're doing EAA, does the EAA software do any registration and align those frames while they're stacking on the fly, or is it just sort of blur out at the corners?
No. So what it will do is it will literally take, as you're capturing them, it will stack, this star on top of that star on top of that star. I mean, if it's absolutely horrible, at some point it will lose the alignment stars and it won't know where to put stuff. But you definitely don't have to be exact. In fact, my primary scope is an alt-az, so it does a phenomenal job. And honestly, it's like you could probably just kind of point it north and get kind of close and not even actually use your polar scope, because by the time you've got your 5 minutes worth of data, you really won't have drifted that much where it can't compensate. Yeah. Obviously, the smaller the sensor, the less that applies. So if you've got a much narrower field of view and your object doesn't have a lot of background stars in it, that might play into it. But again, I think it's much more forgiving than, because of the short number of exposures in the shorter time than it is longer exposure.
Okay. And I agree with Mike. Just to interject, the picture that I'm using as my backdrop with Orion is unguided off my ST80 that's on top of my LX200. So it's like Mike said, the stacking basically compensates for that. Now, if you blow this way up, you can see just a little bit of wobble in the stars, but yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. All right. We'll see if we have any final questions. All right. Well,
Real
again,
quick,
oh yeah, of course.
Michael, just a question on how we want to do it. So I can confirm we can post files in groups IO. I'm here. Do you want me to just create a folder for camera workshop and we can post them there?
Yeah, and maybe could you?
I'll send it out as a link.
Send me an email if there's any anything else we need to know to do, and then I can bounce it out to everyone.
Yep.
And yeah, if you're comfortable sharing your slides, that'd be great. If for some reason that doesn't work, I understand, but we'll try to get what we can up there, and I'll shoot an email out. James, are you on the imaging list?
I'm not for sure. I'll have to check that out.
Okay. I don't think you are by default. I think Steve Izzo is the club member who can get you on there if you aren't.
Steve Izzo?
Sorry, James, I can add you as, or I can send you an invitation. I can't actually add you.
Okay, yeah.
James Toops. Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Everybody calls me Jim.
Okay,
Jim.
Actually, I think it's simpler than that. I think if you just send an email to the images the imaging at raleighastro.org, I believe you're going to get an invitation back. Could be wrong about that.
Right. I joined the ham radio one, so I think
you
should be able to get there. Yeah, that's great.
Easy than that. You just
appreciate
any group you want to join on a group site or IO, you just send it an email and you'll get a response back.
Oh,
I
good.
appreciate it, because I've got a lot of questions being just practically at zero base here that I'd like to do on the forum and try to get some ideas on where to go here. But I want to thank all you guys for putting all this together, and some of it was beyond what I know, but most of it was just really filled in a lot of gaps. So I do appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you for sticking through it. And
No problem.
I'm gonna I'm going to wrap things up here. And thank you again to everyone. And just hit the forums if you have any questions, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for all the presenters.
Thank you. Great job.
Yeah, bye, guys. You want to stop it, Chris?
Do what?
You want to stop the recording?
Yeah, I can stop it.